Are you ready to stop pretending that philosophy lives in dusty libraries and start seeing it as the blood and breath of your daily choices? Have you felt the need for a worldview that actually works in real life, not just in lectures, but in your doubts, your risks, your moral struggles? This video is not a summary. It's not a reading list. It's a guided expedition into the mind of William James, the philosopher who shattered the ivory tower and planted philosophy in the soil of lived experience. You will not leave this video with a neat diagram. You will leave it with a fire in your mind and a map to the essential texts that can ignite it further. Whether you're a student, a seeker, or someone quietly raging against the uselessness of abstract thought, James offers a lifeline. His books do not ask you to believe, they ask you to live. And in this video, we'll walk through those rare works that can rewire your perception, the principles of psychology, the will to believe, pragmatism, the varieties of religious experience, and a pluralistic universe. These are not texts for passive consumption. They are invitations to transform how you think, how you choose, how you become. Don't just watch. Engage. Don't just understand. Respond. This is a call not to study pragmatism, but to practice it. Stay with us. The year is 1890. A monumental text drops into the world not as a manifesto, not as a doctrine, but as a living organism of thought. The Principles of Psychology is not merely a book, it is an event. Written by William James, it defies the rigid boundaries between science and philosophy, between description and introspection. It opens, not with answers, but with a confrontation. Who are you when you think, when you feel, when you choose? James does not pretend to be neutral. He is not the cold anatomist of the mind, he is its passionate cartographer. He writes from the inside, with the full risk of subjectivity, insisting that psychology must not reduce the soul to data points. Every chapter breathes the belief that the mind is not a machine, it is a drama, and so the stream of consciousness flows. Not in parts, not in functions, but in textures. Sensations blur into thoughts, memories surge without permission, emotions crash into logic. James refuses to cut them up. He dares to describe them as they are, wild, flowing, inconsistent, and utterly human. In this work, we find the seeds of pragmatism, not yet a system, but a sensibility. The idea that mental states are not inert, that they mean something because they do something. That belief is not a mirror of reality, but a force that shapes it. That every idea, to matter, must make a difference. In experience, he studies attention, will, habit not as dry phenomena, but as doors to freedom. The self, he shows us, is not fixed. It is formed through struggle, through choice, through the will to act. And here begins his rebellion against determinism, against the illusion that we are mere spectators of our lives. If you're watching this now, it's because something in you already resists passivity. Like, subscribe, and let the principles of psychology become more than a book. Let it be your entry into a new way of inhabiting your mind. It is 1896. William James stands before the tremble of uncertainty and does not flinch. He writes the will to believe not to comfort the credulous, but to defend the sacred right to risk belief in the absence of proof. This is no defense of irrationality. It is a cry for the ethical dignity of the undecided. A stance for those who live in the shadowland between facts and commitments. This essay is often misunderstood. Critics said James was giving license to superstition, but they missed the tremor at the heart of his argument, the recognition that life demands decisions before evidence is complete. That neutrality is often a disguised form of surrender. That to wait forever for certainty is to let go of life itself. James draws a line. On one side, the logic of safe skepticism. On the other, the existential risk of belief. But he doesn't argue that we must always believe. He argues that sometimes, especially in moral and spiritual matters, not. To believe is to lose a chance forever. He gives examples: friendship, love, moral resolve, faith. These are not matters where infinite postponement is possible. The opportunity passes. The window closes. The soul becomes timid. The will grows weak. And in that moment, James says, we must be free to choose not as dogmatists, but as moral agents. The will to believe is the will to act in the face of uncertainty. It is the courage to say yes without guarantees. It is the strength to stand where reason hesitates, not because reason is rejected, but because life cannot wait. In this, James reveals a deeper philosophy, that beliefs are not judged only by their origin, but by their destiny, not only by what they reflect, but by what they enable, not only by their logic, but by their fruit. This is a hard teaching. It is not for the detached academic. It is for the trembling soul who must choose again and again. Without the luxury of perfect knowledge. To read the will to believe is to awaken a new kind of conscience, not a conscience that fears error, above all, but one that fears the paralysis of inaction. James does not say, believe anything. He says, believe where it matters, and where not to believe is to betray your own becoming. By 1907, William James gives the movement a name. He steps fully into the arena with pragmatism, a new name for some old ways of thinking. But this is no philosophical rebranding. This is a manifesto against abstraction, against the tyranny of systems that explain everything and answer nothing. It is a call to reclaim truth from the frozen altars of logic and return it to the wild fields of life. James opens with a tone that is almost confessional. He knows what it means to be trapped in metaphysical debates, to be seduced by dazzling concepts that do not help you live. But he also knows that philosophy can be something else. A tool, not a temple. A method for navigating actual problems, not a shrine to eternal categories. In pragmatism, he sets the terms. Truth is not a property of an idea in itself. Truth is what happens to an idea when it is lived, when it is tested in experience, when it proves itself in practice. He turns away from the correspondence theory and says, simply, if it works, if it guides us, if it helps us live better and see more clearly, then it is true, but not forever. Not absolutely, only for now and for this context. This is a truth that walks, not one that sits on a throne. He goes further. Ideas, he says, must be judged by their consequences, not by their elegance, but by their effects. A belief is not innocent. It acts. It shapes behavior, relationships, institutions, inner lives. And so the philosopher becomes not a collector of systems, but a moral psychologist of the human condition. James sees two temperaments in philosophy, the tough-minded and the tender-minded. The tough demand facts, clarity, proof. The tender seek meaning, hope, value. Pragmatism, he says, can reconcile them. It does not choose between cold reason and warm faith. It asks what each can contribute to our actual struggles. This is why pragmatism is not just a method. It is a way of being, a refusal to worship ideas that do not serve life, a rebellion against metaphysical closure. A tenderness toward the provisional. To read this book is to feel philosophy come alive again, not as dogma, but as experiment. Not as closure, but as invitation. There are moments in history when philosophy steps down from the podium and walks among the suffering. In 1902, with the publication of the Varieties of Religious Experience, William James does exactly that. He gathers the visions, the crises, the mystical illuminations, and the broken prayers of individuals across time, not to judge them, but to listen, not to explain them away, but to take them seriously as windows into the soul. James begins not with creeds or institutions, but with experience. He wants to know what religion feels like, where it begins, not in doctrine, but in the deepest folds of personal consciousness. He interviews the sick soul, the twice-born, the mystic, the convert, feed-sparing, and the saved. He brings us into their inner worlds not to normalize or universalize them, but to reveal how plural the human search for meaning truly is. And here, his pragmatism takes a radical turn. He does not ask if a religious belief corresponds to a metaphysical reality. He asks, what does it do? How does it function in a person's life? Does it heal? Does it empower? Does it bring peace, courage, transformation? This is not relativism. It is a moral empiricism. He insists that religious experience must be judged not by abstract standards, but by its fruits for life, for conduct, for character. And so the divine, for James, is not a doctrine. It is an event, a rupture, a new possibility that enters consciousness and alters it. He is open to the idea that something more exists, but he is more concerned with the more that already acts within us. In this way, the Varieties of Religious Experience is a book about pluralism in its most intimate form. It teaches us that no single narrative can capture the scope of spiritual life, that the universe, if it holds meaning, may reveal it in fractured, contradictory, deeply personal ways. And it asks a question that cannot be ignored. What if your most private experience, your terror, your ecstasy, your longing contains truths no theology can systematize and no science can dismiss? James does not give an answer. He offers a lens, a posture, a humility before the irreducible depth of what it means to be alive. It is 1909, and William James delivers one of his boldest challenges yet to the intellectual habits of the age. A Pluralistic Universe is not just a continuation of his philosophy, it is its metaphysical climax. Here, James turns fully toward the cosmos itself and says, the universe is not one, but many. Not a finished system, but an ongoing experiment. Not a machine, but a growing thing. He begins with a series of lectures that seem almost confessional. He is not writing from the safety of a study, but from the exposed position of a man wrestling with ultimate questions. Unity, he says, may be comforting, but it is false. The craving for an all-explaining one is a psychological need, not a metaphysical discovery. Instead, he proposes pluralism, the view that reality is made up of many parts, many centers of experience, many wills and forces that do not reduce to a single law or essence. The universe, in this vision, is more like a democracy than a monarchy. It is a republic of truths, not a dictatorship of the absolute. And this is not just an abstract claim. James shows how monism often leads to spiritual tyranny. It declares, only one truth, only one kind of experience, only one way of being. Pluralism, by contrast, welcomes mess, tension, multiplicity. It says, there is more than one way to be real. He borrows from thinkers as diverse as Fechner, Bergson, and Lotze, weaving a vision of a cosmos that is still in the making, unfinished, unstable, open. This openness is not a weakness. It is a source of moral and existential vitality. It means that our efforts, our sufferings, our creations matter. They become part of the unfolding of what reality becomes. James insists that the universe is not inert. It listens. It responds. It evolves. It is not a tomb, it is a conversation. To read A Pluralistic Universe is to realize that philosophy is not a map of what is, but a plea for what might still become. It is a kind of courage, a refusal to bow before finality, and a willingness to think while everything is still at stake. As we now gather the fragments of James' essential texts, a deeper image begins to emerge, not of a system, but of a sensibility. Each book is a door, and behind each door, another world. But these are not separate worlds. They form a constellation. And if you allow them to reshape your perception, you begin to see the outline of a different way of doing philosophy. It is a philosophy rooted in risk. Across these works, James never retreats into abstraction. He wades into ambiguity, contradiction, psychic pain, mystical rapture. He refuses to resolve them. He holds them open, lets them breathe. He asks, what does it mean to think with your whole being? Not just with logic, but with your fears, your hopes, your flesh? In the Principles of Psychology, he showed us that consciousness is not an object to be dissected, but a stream to be inhabited. In The Will to Believe, he defended the dignity of choosing without guarantees. In Pragmatism, he called truth a tool for living, not a trophy to possess. In the Varieties, he took the most fragile human experiences and held them up not to destroy, but to understand. And in A Pluralistic Universe, he asked us to look at the cosmos not as a dead order, but as an alive becoming. What emerges is not a doctrine. It is a style of engagement, a way to live in a world that never fully makes sense. A world that speaks in multiple voices, offers no final script, and yet demands that you act, believe, and respond. James never said this would be comfortable. He said it would be real. And now, the invitation turns inward. Which of these texts dares you to think differently, not just about ideas, but about your life? Imagine now the student who reads James not to pass an exam, but to survive a crisis. Or the philosopher who reads Pragmatism not for clarity, but for courage. Or the seeker who finds in the Varieties a mirror of their secret experiences. These texts are not passive artifacts. They are interventions. And this is James' deeper legacy. He redefined what a philosophical text could be. Not a system to memorize, but a challenge to embody. Each work asks you to live as if ideas mattered, not just in argument, but in relationship, in grief, in belief, in choice. When you walk with James, you walk into the world with different eyes. You begin to see how every claim to truth is situated, how every belief carries risk, how the soul's needs are not embarrassing detours from philosophy, they are its hidden source. This is why his books endure, because they do not tell you what to think. They ask how you will respond. They assume you are already inside the moral struggle, already torn between knowing and choosing, between logic and love. James gives you no safety. What he gives is permission. Permission to not know and still move forward. Permission to honor your experience even when it defies the categories. Permission to read, not for mastery, but for transformation. So we ask again, these texts are waiting, alive, unfinished. Will you enter them merely as a reader, or as someone willing to be changed? The reader who enters James' world expecting resolution will be disappointed, but the one who enters seeking a companion for their inner unrest will find something rare, a philosophy that does not rush to silence your doubts, but lingers with you in them. A body of work that does not promise peace, but invites you to cultivate it through struggle, through practice, through radical honesty. Each of James' essential texts is both an argument and a mirror. They reflect your hunger for meaning, your exhaustion with empty abstractions, your intuition that truth must somehow include your wounds. They offer no final blueprint, but they model a way of thinking that is fierce in its humility and brave in its refusal to close the question. James shows us that thought must be intimate. That belief is always personal. That philosophy must not flee from the particular, the flawed, the felt. In doing so, he restores dignity to the messiness of human life. And that life, he insists, is where philosophy begins not in axioms, but in the cracked and luminous texture of experience. So when you pick up these texts, do not read them as historical documents. Read them as field manuals, as living companions, as provocations. Let them interrupt you. Let them unsettle your categories. Let them make you choose. And finally, remember, James' work is not a temple, it is a threshold. What you find on the other side depends on how much of yourself you're willing to bring. This is the final threshold. And it does not lead to an answer, but to a question that deepens the further you go. William James did not write for disciples. He wrote for thinkers, for feelers, for wanderers, for those too honest to pretend that one idea could ever explain everything. His essential texts are not sacred scrolls, they are living provocations. They burn, not with dogma, but with the urgency to live a life of meaning. In every book, he returns to one radical claim, that experience is primary, not theory, not structure, experience. And if our thinking does not return us to experience, with more compassion, more precision, more courage, then it has failed. So what do we do with these texts? We do not reduce them to footnotes, we let them speak. We let them breathe into our dilemmas, our convictions, our quiet moments of rupture. We read James not because he tells us what to believe, but because he makes belief possible again for those of us too wounded by certainty. The principles of psychology, the will to believe, pragmatism, the varieties of religious experience, a pluralistic universe, these are not stages in a system. They are flames in a constellation. You do not read them once. You return to them when life demands it. And now, in closing, one last question for you. What kind of truth would you need not to win the argument, but to live more fully, more deeply, more truly? If this journey has stirred something in you, an unrest, a hunger, a new kind of attention, please like, subscribe, and share this with 3 people who might need to think differently, not more correctly, more humanly.